De-dollarization is coming. Politicians in the US are already freaking out about the prospect that they won't be able to punish other countries using the supremacy of the dollar.
Brazil, in our hemisphere, largest country in the Western Hemisphere south of us, cut a trade deal with China. They're going to, from now on, do trade in their own currencies, get right around the dollar. They're creating a secondary economy in the world, totally independent of the United States. We won't have to talk about sanctions in 5 years because there'll be so many countries transacting in currencies other than the dollar that we won't have the ability to sanction them.
You've probably heard people say de-dollarization will be the beginning of the end for US hegemony and bring about an entirely new global financial system that replaces the dollar. And as crazy as that might sound, it's not only likely, but there are already dozens of countries working to make this a reality.
Every night I ask myself, why should every country have to be tied to the dollar for trade? Why can't we trade in our own currency? Today, a country needs to run after dollars in order to export, when it could export in its own currency. Who decided that the dollar was the currency after gold?
What's left of a nation so torn, being played against each other from the day that we're born? What's left of a country stripped bare by greedy corporations and rapacious billionaires? What's left? Once the vultures are through, will there even be a country left for me and you? What's left? Once the fantasy fades and there's nothing but reality to smack us in the face, what's left? Are a people in pain, abandoned by their government and struggling to maintain? What's left is a nation enraged, with more and more becoming disillusioned each day. I'm left, and I'm here to stay, to make you feel uncomfortable and show you a better way. I'm left, but I'm not alone. There's millions more just like me, and not one will they own. We're the left, and we won't be ignored. The masses have been ignited, so brace for the storm. I said we're left, and we won't be ignored. The masses are ignited, better brace for the storm.
Following the end of World War II, Europe found many of its cities decimated and much of its resources depleted, leaving the world's superpowers prior to the Second World War in utter disarray, while the United States, which was already on its meteoric ascension, was left mainly untouched by the war, letting it invest in and build up its manufacturing capabilities unhindered. This enabled the United States to take a leading role at the most pivotal point of the 20th century, setting the course for much of the world for decades to come. The economic underpinning and foundational structure of our newfound dominance was established with the Bretton Woods Agreement, a monetary arrangement that was ratified by 44 of the world's most influential countries at a conference held in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire in 1944. Along with birthing two of the most predatory institutions ever created, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. More on those later. The arrangement stipulated that the other nations present would peg their currency to the US dollar, which would in turn be tied to the price of gold, making it the undisputed world's reserve currency and the new standard for doing business internationally. This, coupled with the huge investments in manufacturing made during the war, along with the hard-fought labor reforms won by the American people prior and during the Roosevelt administration, led to multiple decades of substantial financial growth for the owner class and many of its workers. But unfortunately, by the 70s, our leaders were blatantly abusing this highly beneficial system by printing far more money than they could actually back, in order to subsidize and bail out big business whenever needed and to better sustain their policy of endless war. Sound familiar?
As the US entered an inflationary crisis, countries started to demand their gold back. In order to stop the bleeding, the Nixon administration suspended the convertibility of the dollar into gold in 1971. The US kept the gold and left the rest of the world holding dollars.
After the repeal of the gold standard, the United States needed a new commodity to fix the dollar to stop the bleeding back home, and more importantly for the ruling class, to maintain economic and global hegemony. Not only was the empire able to accomplish this, but the solution actually increased the international demand for the US dollar. That solution, of course, became known as the petrodollar. The deal for the petrodollar was hammered out when Secretary of State Henry Kissinger went to Saudi Arabia to meet with the royal family in the early 70s. Per the deal, Saudi Arabia would gain the protection of the U.S. military, as well as access to its vast array of high-tech weapons and munitions, along with a guarantee of protection from the well-armed and extremely aggressive apartheid state of Israel. In return, Saudi Arabia would make the U.S. dollar the one and only currency used for buying and selling oil, meaning if a nation wanted to buy oil from the petro giant, they would always need a healthy reserve of U.S. dollars, which set the standard and eventually leads to most international deals being done this way. The Saudis also agreed to use their surplus oil proceeds to buy up U.S. Treasury bonds and other debt securities, further inflating the value of U.S. currency. And by 1975, the other members of the world's largest oil cartel, OPEC, also agreed to this new petrodollar system, ensuring that the U.S. military would be an ever-present and destabilizing staple in the Middle East for many, many years. Not that they weren't already, of course. The dollar was now stronger than it had ever been before, which meant that it could be weaponized against smaller and often resource-rich countries, forcing them to fall in line with the U.S.'s neoliberal agenda, which usually boils down to implementing austerity measures on the nation's people and privatizing their infrastructure, their natural resources, and anything else worth taking. There are two main ways this is accomplished, the first being through debt traps set by the IMF and the World Bank.
Here enters the IMF, who in the early 80s, along with the World Bank, became the global purveyors of neoliberal orthodoxy. The model was simple. An overexploited third world nation, usually a former colony that only recently became independent, is burdened by inequalities and industrial deficiencies as a result of colonialism. These nations also usually were economically sanctioned or otherwise limited by their former colonial masters, who would demand colonial taxes even after independence. Through high-interest funds borrowed from the IMF, said nations couldn't pay back everything to the letter that the IMF desired, usually by design, and as a result would be forced to undergo so-called structural adjustment programs, where welfare cuts, liberalization of the market, and privatization took place, usually with ownership transferring back from said third world state to the former colonial power or whatever imperialist hegemon, be they local or global. This is going on to this day, with the most recent being IMF payments to Ghana, which historically came with strings attached such as raising electricity and water tariffs, mass privatization of water resources and mining facilities, cuts to public sector employment, and other so-called cost-cutting measures. Ghana currently pays between 70% and 100% of government revenue to meet these requirements each year, in a cycle meant to keep them paying to the benefit of the imperial core. Likewise with Egypt, that has agreed to sell off $2 billion worth of state assets along with slashes to public sector spending, the cutting of state subsidies which over 30 million Egyptians in poverty rely on to keep basic staples affordable, as well as privatization of over 30 state-owned companies ranging from water purification to oil and gas.
The second and current favored way to weaponize the US dollar is by implementing crippling economic sanctions. And at first glance, sanctions may seem like a welcome alternative to the millions of deaths and tens of millions of displaced people caused by an all-out war, and/or terrorizing civilian populations with unseen drones of death from the sky. But the reality is that sanctions are actually just as deadly, if not more so, than conventional warfare. As the sanctions imposed on Afghanistan after the devastating and fruitless 20-plus year invasion and occupation acutely illustrates, 22.8 million Afghanis are currently facing high levels of food insecurity. That's over half of the country's population now on the verge of starvation, many of which being children, with over 1 million currently experiencing severe malnutrition. And even if they are lucky enough not to starve to death, being malnourished greatly increases the likelihood that they could die from usually non-deadly diseases. The rest of the country is not doing so well either, as according to the UN, an astronomical 98% of the country is not getting their daily recommended amount of caloric intake. And it's not just the specific sanctions that are the problem either, as the United States has sought fit to seize more than $7 billion of the perpetually poor country's assets, which is equivalent to about 40% of the entire Afghan economy, or about 14 months' worth of essential imports such as food, medicine, infrastructure needs, and other goods that are vital to the survival of its people. But it's even worse than that. For a country to have a stable economy, it needs to have a healthy amount of international reserves, which today equates to US dollars. Predictably, the confiscation of these reserves has triggered a domino effect, causing bank runs, cash shortages, and other devastating effects that have crippled the Afghan economy. Within the first 4 months of the sanctions implementation, the Afghan currency has depreciated more than 30%, triggering skyrocketing inflation on essential goods like food and medicine. Of course, Washington argues that these sanctions and seizures are nothing but a necessary response to the human rights abuses of the Taliban, especially its notorious repression of women. But this ignores many key facts, such as the fact that millions of the very women and children they purport to be so concerned with are now suffering directly because of these sanctions. That the Taliban itself was literally armed, trained, and empowered by none other than the United States. And perhaps least well known but no less important, that prior to the U.S. plucking the Taliban out of the hills of eastern Afghanistan to serve as our proxy, women were actually way more free, well-educated, and prosperous than they have ever been since. Please click the card above or check the description below if you would like to learn more. And all of that is to say that the U.S. does not actually care about the well-being of Afghanis or any other population they purport to be trying to liberate or bring democracy to. Those are just excuses to cover up their true goals, which always boil down to controlling and exploiting a local population and their natural resources. Exact numbers are hard to come by, but anywhere from 39 to 50 some countries are currently under U.S.-led sanctions, or about 1/3 of the world's economy. And again, sanctions are a form of warfare that directly targets civilians and disproportionately affect the most vulnerable among any given population. An insidious and pervasive form of warfare designed to destroy decades of progress in healthcare, sanitation, housing, infrastructure, and industrial development around the world. And this is not as hard to accomplish as one may think. By simply sanctioning certain key items such as mechanical parts needed to operate heavy machinery, farming equipment and seed, and essential medical supplies, it's possible to keep a country stagnant and underdeveloped in perpetuity. Why would we want to do this, you may be wondering? Well, mainly because the empire cannot afford to have any of these so-called developing nations ever actually succeed in their development. Because if they did, it would be much harder to come in and extract their resources and wealth at will. The wealth that the West has been using to prop up its own economies for centuries. Especially if that nation has the nerve to want to use their natural resources to uplift and better their own people, instead of letting the Western corporations come in and extract it for a fraction of what it's worth.
So one of the laws of capitalist motion and development is this inexorable expansion. And that means expansion into an expropriation of the third world. A process that's been going on for about 400 years, perpetrated by the Portuguese, the Spaniards, the Dutch, the Belgians, the French, the English, and most recently, most successfully, most impressively, by the Americans. That is by the ruling classes of these countries, not by the ordinary people. The ordinary people simply paid the costs of empire. The ordinary people simply sent their sons off to die on the plains of India or in the jungles of the Congo or in Latin America, wherever else. But that expropriation of the third world has been going on for 400 years, brings us to another revelation, namely that the third world is not poor. You don't go to poor countries to make money. There are very few poor countries in this world. Most countries are rich. The Philippines are rich. Brazil is rich. Mexico is rich. Chile is rich. Only the people are poor. But there's billions to be made there, to be carved out and to be taken. There's been billions for 400 years. The capitalist European and North American powers have carved out and taken the timber, the flax, the hemp, the cocoa, the rum, the tin, the copper, the iron, the rubber, the bauxite, the slaves, and the cheap labor. They have taken out of these countries. These countries are not underdeveloped, they're overexploited.
If sanctions are able to keep a country struggling and their economy stagnant, that's all well and good. But ideally, they are meant to lead to regime change, to the implementation of a puppet leader in the mold of Volodymyr Zelensky or Olaf Scholz, someone who will gladly do the bidding of their masters without question, even to the detriment of their own people. After sanctions inevitably cause hyperinflation, shortages of essential goods, and other economic disruptions, the leaders that the U.S. would like to remove are hypocritically blamed as the cause, as is currently the case in Cuba, Venezuela, Syria, and many other countries. The hope is that the now desperate people will rise up to do the CIA's dirty work for them. Their airwaves are simultaneously flooded with U.S.-funded propaganda to misinform the people and focus their righteous anger at those the U.S. wish to remove. And even if an organic uprising does take place, it is quickly co-opted and turned into one of the CIA's infamous Keller revolutions, as happened at the Maidan Square in 2014, which kicked off the U.S.'s devastating and ongoing proxy war in Ukraine. Click here if you would like to learn more. So even though the Geneva Convention and international law explicitly prohibit the targeting of defenseless populations, sanctions are nonetheless a widely used weapon in the empire's arsenal. Because between our state-of-the-art and ever-present military and our dominance over international trade and finance, the U.S. empire can seemingly do anything it pleases with little to no consequences or concern for its actions. In fact, when the International Criminal Court considered bringing charges against the U.S. military for war crimes committed in Afghanistan, then National Security Advisor and infamous war criminal himself, John Bolton, threatened to arrest and sanction the international body, stating, quote, "If the court comes after us, Israel, or other U.S. allies, we will not sit quietly." The U.S. is prepared to slap financial sanctions and criminal charges on officials of the court if they proceed against any U.S. personnel. We will ban its judges and prosecutors from entering the United States. We will sanction their funds in the U.S. financial system, and we will prosecute them in the U.S. criminal system. We will do the same for any company or state that assists the ICC investigation of Americans. They then proceeded to revoke the visa of the chief prosecutor proposing the inquiry into U.S. war crimes committed in Afghanistan. And then there's the infamous Hague Invasion Act that was signed into law by George W. Bush, conveniently just prior to the illegal invasion and occupation of Iraq. The act states that the U.S. military can and will use force to jailbreak any American official or military personnel being held by the international body, because apparently the U.S. empire is above international law. This is how the U.S. can prevent Syria from rebuilding after the war we more than helped to wage and ultimately lost. How we can continue to occupy, or in their words, own, a third of the country, which just so happens to be the resource-rich third or economic powerhouse that holds the nation's oil and wheat.
The United States still had compelling forms of leverage on the table to shape an outcome that was more conducive and protective of U.S. interests. And we identified four. So the first one was the 1/3 of Syrian territory that was owned via the U.S. military with its local partner, the Syrian Democratic Forces. And that 1/3 of Syria is the resource-rich, it's the economic powerhouse of Syria. So where the hydrocarbons are, which obviously is very much in the public debate here in Washington these days, as well as the agricultural powerhouse. The rest of Syria, though, is rubble. And what the Russians want and what Assad wants is economic reconstruction. And that is something that the United States can basically hold a card on via the international financial institutions and our cooperation with the Europeans. So we argued that absent behavioral changes by the Assad regime, we should hold the line on preventing reconstruction aid and technical expertise from going back into Syria.
Or in other words, the best words.
We're keeping the oil. We have the oil. The oil is secure. We left troops behind only for the oil.
This is how we can blockade a country like Cuba, stagnating its development for more than half a century. This is how and why we helped our partners in the lucrative petrodollar scheme, the Saudis, starve to death tens of thousands of children in Yemen. It was simply just part of the deal. The deal from which the U.S. dollar derives its power. Power it uses to maintain U.S. hegemony around the world. And these are but a few of the abuses the empire has used that power to get away with for over half a century. Or as the Venezuelan ambassador to the UN put it, these arbitrary measures called sanctions are, quote, economic terrorism, which affect a third of humanity with more than 8,000 measures in 39 countries. It's a threat to the entire system of international relations and is the greatest violation of human rights in the world. I could go on, but I think you get the point. Sanctions are a crime against humanity, a brutal and deliberate act of warfare that target the most defenseless among us, the youth, the elderly, the sick and disabled, all at a time when things like hunger and disease are fairly easy to solve. Yet instead of using our immense power to eradicate them for good, we would rather use them to manufacture even more suffering in an attempt to maintain our fading hegemony. And if you think U.S. officials have any remorse about being responsible for so much needless death and suffering, you would be wrong.
We have heard that 500,000 children have died. I mean, that's more children than died in Hiroshima. And you know, is the price worth it?
I think this is a very hard choice, but we think the price is worth it.
That was Bill Clinton's Secretary of State, Madeleine Albright, smugly showing no remorse for the sanctions responsible for killing over 500,000 Iraqi children in the early 90s. Sanctions that obviously did not work, seeing as Saddam was still their leader when we illegally invaded and occupied the country a decade later, killing over 1 million people in the process. And that's perhaps the saddest, or at least the most ironic part, that despite all the senseless suffering they cause, sanctions rarely achieve their stated goals. With the notable exception of the sanctions imposed on apartheid South Africa, which had overwhelming popular support worldwide, sanctions alone are actually pretty ineffective at forcing a specific outcome. Interesting side note, the United States outright opposed placing sanctions on South Africa until Congress was able to override Ronald Reagan's veto in 1986, and officially considered Nelson Mandela a terrorist until 2008. But the more and more the United States imposes sanctions, the less effective they are becoming, with there being no clearer case of this fact than the endless rounds of sanctions imposed on Russia since the start of the conflict in Ukraine, which have had little to no negative effect on its economy nor its people. We even seized $300 billion of Russian international reserves to no avail. All it did was give Russia a reason to start trading globally in rubles instead of dollars, and make adversaries and allies alike think twice about their own dollar reserves. I could spend an entire video detailing how and why these sanctions not only failed, but epically boomeranged back to blow up in the faces of Europe and to a lesser degree the United States. But the point is, they've failed spectacularly. Not only have they utterly failed at slowing down the Russian war machine, their economy is the best it's been since the start of the conflict in 2014. In 2022, Russia had the 8th highest GDP in the world, cracking the top 10 for the first time since the war began, and the ruble is now stronger than it was at that point. Meanwhile, in the West, without access to cheap Russian gas, Germany is now on the verge of being forced to deindustrialize, and the price of food and energy has skyrocketed all across the continent, with things getting so bad in the UK that they were forced to open up over 3,000 so-called warm banks for families unable to pay their skyrocketing energy bills. Of course, the US was rocked by inflation as well, with the price hikes only starting to calm down recently. But the effects are certainly still being felt, as this recent CNN article points out. The average family is spending around $709 per month more than they were just 2 years ago, and I highly doubt their wages have kept up with the added costs. But more concerning for those that rule over us, the importance and power of the US dollar on the global stage has been dropping at an astronomical rate, with more and more countries looking to de-dollarize, choosing instead to trade in their own currencies or gold.
Despite the US's repeated attempts to maintain its supremacy over the world financial system, more and more countries are setting up agreements to do trade in their local currencies and gold instead of the dollar. It would take too long to go through each example, so here's a list of countries that have moved to de-dollarize in the last year.
And in 2001, a commanding 71% of all global reserves were held in US dollars. But by 2021, that number dropped to 55%, which is bad, but over the next year, it plummeted a whopping 8%. That's 10 times the pace of the previous 2 decades. And of course, 2022 is the year the proxy war in Ukraine ratcheted up both on the battlefield with Russia invading as well as in the economic arena, with the US dishing out a dozen or so rounds of various sanctions on the Ruskies. But unfortunately for the West, neither campaign is going the way they would like. And it's so obvious that even Business Insider has to admit that the dollar's drop-off is at least in part due to the sanctions imposed on Russia, stating that these exceptional actions, i.e. sanctioning one of the world's largest suppliers of energy and straight up stealing their international reserves, had made many nations less willing to hold on to the dollar. I wonder why.
Why would the world continue to use the dollar when the dollar is used as a weapon against the ones who use it? The great irony of the dollar standard is that it forces all of the countries that are rich in resources and labor to hand over their real wealth in exchange for pieces of paper that cost a few cents to print. When the US suspended the dollar's convertibility into gold in 1971, then Treasury Secretary John Connally shocked reporters when he said, "The dollar is our currency, but it's your problem." Now the world is waking up and saying, this is our wealth you want, and that's your problem.
And it's not like our leaders couldn't see this coming, as this quote from U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen illustrates. But unfortunately, they just can't help themselves. They're like an addict who's been able to thus far maintain their family and cushy job despite their increasingly violent and destructive outbursts. They've been getting away with it for so long that they actually believe no one else is on to them, and that they can maintain their abusive ways without any consequences. And by the time they realize that that's not the case, they're already on the verge of getting fired, their savings have dried up, and their spouse is talking to somebody else. And in this case, that someone else is BRICS, which has already surpassed the G7 in total GDP. What is BRICS, you may be wondering? Well, that's what we'll be detailing in part 2. But basically, it's made up of nations we've been trying to isolate over the past few decades, principally Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, hence the acronym. But there are at least 23 other nations that have expressed interest in joining the blossoming economic bloc. And as I'm typing this, it's just been announced at the annual summit taking place this year in Johannesburg, South Africa, that BRICS, or BRICS Plus, I should say, will be accepting 6 new members: Saudi Arabia, Egypt, the United Arab Emirates, Argentina, Iran, and Ethiopia, with many, many more vying for a seat at the much more diverse and equitable economic table. Thanks for watching. Tune in next time as we explore the ramifications of abusing the power derived from dollar dominance and what that has led to, namely BRICS Plus, as well as what comes next for both the world and the United States. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share if you appreciate this type of content. Jana.
You know, the United States, with Bretton Woods, 1945, you know, this is, you really have to understand what happened at the end of World War II. Yes, the Nazis were defeated. Well, not the ones in Ukraine, apparently, but the Nazis were defeated. Wonderful. But after that, at the same time, even you know, before victory in Europe was achieved, you had a group of people, the capitalists in Washington and London, already planning a new architecture for the planet, for the world. Now, you know, to say that they were well-intentioned is, yeah, I mean, that's a joke, you know. Just because they're not Nazis doesn't mean they're necessarily nice people. What they did is they you know, they had the dollar pegged to the gold standard, and that was until, you know, Nixon, and then I almost said Petro Yuan. It's coming very soon. I meant petrodollar, and you know, the thing is, the United States weaponized this, right? So I mean, the United States can peg the dollar to acorns for all I care. The thing is that they weaponize the dollar against other people, right? So when you're using that to starve people, and remember, with sanctions, they make you think like, oh, sanctions, they're, you know, right now Assad cannot buy another swimming pool or something, or a chandelier, because he's sanctioned, you know. That is ridiculous. leaders, political leaders, especially heads of state in other countries, they are more or less insulated from sanctions. Their standard of living does not drop because they are sanctioned. Their people's standard of living does. And then the hope, the mentality behind this is that, well, if we make people angry and tired and starve, enough in this country, that they will rise up and get rid of that leader for us. And it never works. I mean, show me one example where this worked. It doesn't work. They sanctioned Iraq, and that was approved by the UN, which is disgusting. But again, it was a US-led effort, of course, right? Sanctions in the 1990s. 500,000 Iraqi children killed. I don't even know what the number is for the adults because it's just, I mean, I think the first figure speaks for itself. And he remained in power, by the way, so it's not like it achieved anything. These are things you can quantify, you can measure, you can study as fact that just like cluster bombs, sanctions kill and hurt civilians more than anyone. This is an indisputable fact. Nothing anyone says can change that, and people have had enough. It's really that simple. I think they should have had enough a long time ago. It shouldn't have taken for the United States to steal $300 billion from the Russians for them to like suddenly wake up. But again, it's a process that started before, but this was just simply the last straw, I think.